Hello everyone, this will be a long episode. When the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine started in 2022, I almost couldn't sleep for several nights, glued to the news and watching podcasts. The Russian invasion actually started in 2014 when they annexed Crimea in March of that year and then invaded the Donbas regions of Donetsk and Luhansk in April. Since then, it has been a tug of war. Eventually, in 2022, Putin proclaimed the independence of the so-called People's Republics in Donetsk and Luhansk. But whatever the case, that first phase of the invasion in 2014, with its fake referendum at gunpoint in Crimea and Russian tanks in the Donbas, set the stage. Then in 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion, attacking the entire territory of Ukraine by land, sea and air. And messages of many preachers emerged as they rushed to comment on Ukraine and Russia, some favoring Russia's narrative, others rooting for Ukraine. Among them, a few caught my attention because, as a Ukrainian by birth, who speaks both languages, Ukrainian and Russian, I could easily identify them, parroting the exact propaganda found on Russian state television. My name is Igor Dovzhyk, I am a Ukrainian by birth, Spanish citizen, ministering in northwest Spain, holding to the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, 1689. I listened to a few of Matthew Trewhella's messages years ago, even before COVID-19, particularly his sermons on feminism and his defense of a complementarian perspective. I hope I pronounce his last name correctly, Trewhella. While I certainly haven't heard his name on every topic, he lost all credibility with me once I heard his comments on the Russia-Ukraine war. The sermon that I want to comment on was published on sermonaudio.com on March 13th, 2022, and it is called Ukraine Situation, an Alternative View. It is on YouTube as well. But why address a speech given 4 years into this war? Well, first of all, I started this personal channel in English, and I didn't have it then. So as I started it now, I'll respond to Matthew Trewhella's statements on this platform. Some would say that it is unfair because since then the Kremlin has changed the script. For instance, though they didn't completely abandon Biolabs rhetoric, they largely switched to fighting Western hegemony, traditional values and territorial defense and so on. At the end of the day, the ideological scripts may keep changing, but geography remains when it comes to untapped natural gas reserves waiting in the Black Sea. So sorry for Russian speakers in Donbas, but it's a war for resources. It's not about Russian language or other cover stories. But secondly, I have found no evidence that Trewhella has retracted his statements. Therefore, I must assume he still adheres to what he said. But if there is any proof of him changing or even softening his rhetoric, I would gladly welcome it so I can correct myself. As it stands, this is the discourse he leaves behind. And the thing is, his speech isn't just neutral, it's aggressively pro-Russian. He managed to pack into a single hour an amount of talking points that would take state-sponsored Russian propagandists an entire week to spew. His passion reminds me of history's classic useful idiots, the kind who became so zealous that they might actually supersede the people they are defending. Now, professional Russian propagandists are paid for their job. So why do you put so much unearned zeal into defending Moscow for free? But whatever the case, his message on the war is still out there, people are still listening to it, and there is still a vital need to confront this version of events. Thirdly, a specific sermon like this acts as a crossroads where several Russian propaganda clichés intersect. It is a collection of falsehoods gathered in one spot, making it incredibly convenient to address and refute them all in a single sitting, or most of them in a single sitting. In a way, he has served up his entire narrative on a silver platter by storing all these myths in one place. Sadly, there are still well-meaning people who believe Russian imperial lies, and refuting pro-Russian rhetoric gathered in one track might be helpful in clarifying what's really going on between Ukraine and Russia, calmly and critically to dismantle the broader web of deception that continues to mislead good people around the world. One of the things conservative Americans are known for is their earnestness. And I mean that in the best way possible. They are honest, they are straightforward, kind, generous, but this earnestness can easily be weaponized against them when you are deeply grieved by the political and cultural direction your country has taken over the last decades. That genuine love for your nation can be exploited. Propagandists manipulate that good-natured patriotism, turning people's best intentions into a vulnerability to push a foreign agenda. I have known some truly amazing American families, incredibly servant-hearted, magnanimous, and hospitable. We've shared wonderful times together, delighting in our fellowship, studying God's Word, praying, singing, and just having fun. There are a lot of guys, though, who blindly buy into Russian narrative scattered across different media outlets. It's a narrative designed to stir up the emotions of liberals and conservatives alike. On one hand, the Kremlin appeals to global socialists by raging against American imperialism and promoting so-called collective rights, i.e. communism in its various forms. Look at Russian allies, China, North Korea, Cuba, Maduro's Venezuela. On the other hand, it turns to Western conservatives and claims that globalist elites want to strip away their liberties, painting Russia as the last fortress of Christian values. The thing is that the Kremlin's Christian fortress is nothing but a cynical marketing campaign. Check out my video, Are Ukrainians More Liberal Than Russians? And I found that especially Texans fall into the trap. Now it goes without saying that I'm not generalizing. During my trip to Texas, I had a great time with amazing people who are incredibly hospitable, sharing what they have and above any expectation, sharing their time and love. And when someone trying to pick the Ukrainian subject realized that I don't stay with the Kremlin, they, standing on a different viewpoint, withdrew from the conversation, trying to change the topic. I assume that it's not because they sensed a defeat, but because they didn't want to hinder the fellowship. Still, others are more aggressive and arrogant, not wanting to reason and just listening to what they like, staying in their echo chambers. When I tried to refute Kremlin state media talking points on Facebook, one user deleted my comments. Surprisingly, he didn't delete my emotional reaction to another participant when I told them, start reading your Bible and go to church. For whatever reason, his selective approach spared that, but the moment I went through the facts encompassing history or giving a logical response to the pro-Kremlin narrative, he deleted my comments. What has happened to the brave cowboys? Examples like these, a cowardly attitude, create an image. It reminds me of a meme with two well-dressed ancient philosophers, which is captioned Eastern Europeans discussing Russian imperialism. Then a picture of an adult teaching a kid saying an Eastern European explaining Russian imperialism to a West European. And finally, a third one showing a massive, offensive gap between a man and another creature, captioning an Eastern European talking with an American about Russian imperialism. Memes like this take root somewhere. You choose to be thin-skinned or lazy and stay in your information bubble, I get it, but you have nothing to teach me about freedoms. I don't want to think what would happen if such a person got into power and had the leverage to manage reality against a narrative they simply chose to like. If they censor thoughts in their private space, thoughts which are not offensive in essence, just a factual reference or logic, what is then their concept of freedom of speech? Well, there's no freedom of speech on my private platform, they may say. Okay, but then what are you afraid of when it comes to a discussion about facts, a discussion that you started? If you don't want to discuss it, don't publish things against Ukraine and stay neutral, but you throw the stone and hide. You insult a nation before kicking people out of your space when they come to answer. You attack a country that didn't do anything wrong to yours and then delete comments when Ukrainians respond. But back to the naivety of sincere, misinformed people. One of the Russian tricks to catch attention is introducing their narrative using one bold word, truth. Oftentimes you see a pro-Russian bot on social media or an influencer of a higher caliber saying something like, "We only want to tell you the truth." The person who actually wants to tell the truth just says it. They don't need to make a loud announcement. What I'm about to say is the truth. I'm not lying. I'm gonna tell you something, but I ain't gonna lie. Now, I'm not good at reproducing accents. I don't live there. I hardly can mimic the Texan accent. Whoa, hey, lazy cat. But I genuinely love accents. I love listening to those American preachers saying, if you got your Bible, turn with me to Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. You know, the real deal. But there is a Latin proverb saying, excusatio non petita, accusatio manifesta, which means an unasked excuse is a manifest accusation, or just an unforced excuse implying guilt. If without anyone even asking whether you are telling the truth, you start by trying to explain that you are not lying, are you trying to sell me something? Are you trying to take me for a ride? Or do you want to usurp the word truth just to win the debate before it even begins? There is a common thread when it comes to usurping terms. Wherever you see an overemphasis, watch it. For instance, wherever politicians overly emphasize the words like democracy or the people, watch out. Just look at the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, or the People's Republic of China. It's the people's, of course it is. Happily enough, Matthew Trewhella's message is called an alternative view, not something like the truth about the war in Ukraine. The latter would be a red flag. Because why would you feel the need to convince me beforehand that what you are about to say is the truth? Shouldn't the facts themselves be convincing enough? Why do you have to over-explain whether you are lying or not? In this edition, I too want to present an alternative view of what is commonly believed among many conservatives. There is an official, so to speak, narrative among many conservatives that Russia is the victim of something, of NATO, of Ukrainian Biolabs, or persecuting Russian speakers, and so on. Usually people ask, how many NATO tanks crossed the border to invade Russia? Why didn't Russia invade Finland and Sweden when they joined NATO? And if those Ukrainian biolabs were really producing weaponized mosquitoes to target Russians, how exactly are those mosquitoes supposed to distinguish between a Russian and a Ukrainian? If Putin supposedly started this military campaign to protect the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, why is it that his army has completely leveled the very cities where those Russian speakers actually lived? I'm not going to sit here and cite everything Trewhella says in his message. It is on Sermon Audio or wherever his show is posted. I warn you, they have an audio issue over there, since he sometimes sounds like speaking into a jar. But honestly, I didn't even listen to his message all the way to the end. Having listened to more than a half, I looked down to my notes and realized they were already way too long. And look, between leading my church and preparing to teach Greek classes at the seminary next week, this level of misinformation is exhausting to respond to. I have heard before on Russian TV the same things from Olga Skabeeva, Vladimir Solovyov, or Margarita Simonyan, and the host with them. I looked at my notes, which were already enough. The script is getting long. Still, I hope my contribution will help some people to look at this whole issue impartially. But enough introduction, let's just dive in. First off, the title, Ukraine Situation and Alternative View. It's a war. It's an invasion. China's government, Russia's ally, used to call it a Ukrainian conflict. We call it the Russian invasion. Governments like the Chinese or Russian avoid such terms. Trewhella chose Proverbs 18:17 as his trampoline text. This reminds me of that classic church joke, which honestly might be a true story somewhere, about the pastor who announced, "I've got an absolutely fantastic sermon ready for the next Sunday. I just need to find a Bible verse for it." But he starts his discourse saying that Americans have been forced into a monolithic narrative on this matter over 2 weeks by when he preached it, namely that Putin is Hitler, Putin's madman, Russia is evil, they want to take over the whole world and reimpose the Soviet Union. A lot has been clarified since then. Look no further than Vladimir Putin's interview with Tucker Carlson, where he openly tried to whitewash Nazi Germany and blame Poland for World War II. He literally argued that Poland went too far and forced the Austrian painter to attack them. The parallels between the two leaders are glaring, and Putin himself is the one who traces them, no need in Fox News. Both relied on the exact same playbook, using manufactured grievances as a pretext to invade a sovereign neighbor. You may be in favor or against them both, but the parallels exist, and Russians admit it. Vladimir Putin himself stunned historians globally by explicitly making the case that Poland provoked Nazi Germany. And Trewhella says, all that sounds familiar? It does sound familiar because Putin famously declared that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. When a leader laments the loss of an empire and then systematically starts invading the countries that gained independence from it, first Georgia, now Ukraine, well, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. Trewhella further concludes, all saying the same thing, that right there should be a red flag to you. I didn't follow the American news all that time, so I can't comment on what all those media said. I watched Ukrainian and Russian news, but that doesn't matter. Why should all saying the same thing automatically be alarming? Trewhella seems to like selecting passages for sermon, so let me help him handle another one. In the book of Judges, all the other tribes were enraged by the wicked, heartless Benjaminite mob at Gibeah, and all tribes united against them. Why should a consensus about an extremely grave atrocity always be suspicious? Next up he says, the Christians, unfortunately, have joined in this chorus. Unfortunately, huh? Go to Ukraine right now, walk into any Protestant or Evangelical church and try repeating that line. Countless American pastors have actually traveled there and seen the reality firsthand. Pick any church you want over there, stand at the pulpit and tell those people to their faces that they are just brainwashed by Fox News and other media. A classic manipulative debate tactic is a false equivalency or amalgamation, forcing two completely unrelated topics into the exact same bouquet to exploit people's frustrations and fears. As he is mixing this war with COVID and pandemic narrative, I realized that he gave that speech in 2022 when everything was still fresh. But it's still a cheap intellectual bait and switch. What do Ukrainians dodging artillery fire having to do with the World Health Organization? And when it comes to Ukraine, his logic might go against him. If he actually bothered to look at the data, he would know that Ukrainians have been one of the nations which are most critical of the official pandemic narrative, resulting in a very high rate of injection hesitancy in Europe. They didn't easily buy into the global mandates, yet they are the ones fighting on the front lines against the Russian invasion. So he seems appealing to emotions right after the COVID, asking, haven't we learned of their censorship to silence any alternative thought to their narratives? Will you talk about the actual brutal censorship in Russia, the journalists jailed, the political dissidents poisoned, and the executives falling from their apartment windows? There were massive protests in Russia when the full-scale invasion started. One episode in Moscow went viral. Search on YouTube for Moscow 2 words. A woman held up a small sign that simply said 2 words, dva slova. She was immediately arrested. Ironically, the next woman who approached wanted to show support for Putin, and she was also taken away by police immediately. The tragedy is that in Russia today, people get arrested not only for opposing the war, but even for reciting poetry in the street. Both young people and the elderly have been detained. There are also disturbing reports and audio recordings of mistreatment in police stations. Those officers aren't Baptist pastors. Will you talk about the persecuted Russian Orthodox priests who are being stripped of their ministries, defrocked, and thrown in prison just for preaching against Putin's war? Will you talk about the harassed, unregistered Baptists and Pentecostals in Russia whose churches are raided by the police and whose pastors are fined? A 63-year-old Pentecostal senior pastor of the Holy Trinity Church in Balashikha near Moscow was physically assaulted and arrested by law enforcement directly because of an anti-war Sunday sermon. Google Ioan Kurmayarov, an Orthodox hieromonk, priest-monk from St. Petersburg, who uploaded YouTube videos criticizing the invasion from a theological perspective. He was imprisoned. On Ukrainian territories occupied by Russia, Christians, especially Protestants, and no matter what denomination, have faced cruel persecution. You have to listen to pastors' testimonies. You may not have known a lot of things back then in 2022, but you sit safely in an American pulpit crying about censorship, while actively defending a tyrannical regime that literally locks up your own Christian brothers and sisters. This is deeply hypocritical. He is sitting there crying about Western censorship, but if you scroll down to his own YouTube comment section, it is packed wall-to-wall with pro-Russian accounts praising his message. Nobody is blocking them, nobody is banning them. The very Western platforms he is attacking are granting his followers the absolute freedom to echo Kremlin talking points without consequence. Thereupon he states, with his side of the story completely censored, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to be alerted that something's wrong here. Again, I don't know whether the American media were censoring Russia's sympathizers. I don't live there. I know that Europe banned Russian propaganda channels, but if you want to be impartial, you should also say that on Russian TV they don't just listen to Tchaikovsky and recite Pushkin, they also threaten to nuke London or Paris or march to Berlin on tanks. They are constantly threatening Europe, your allies. Just balance yourself and don't be partial. You should probably mention also Russians threatening Kazakhstan, Lithuania or Estonia. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out. If North Korea invaded South Korea tomorrow and every politician condemned the invasion, you as Christian still shouldn't support North Korea. It doesn't matter who is saying what. Your ethics matter. But his logic is, if the media says the sky is blue, you have to claim it is green just to prove you are a dissident and that you are not with the bad guys. His mixing of different things, the COVID narrative with the Russian invasion, is highly manipulative. None of us know everything, and maybe there are hidden connections out there, who knows? But we are responsible for what we know and what is right in front of us, not speculative conspiracy theories. But if there is some global conspiracy orchestrated by the elites, then Vladimir Putin is actively playing his part in it. If Putin is doing exactly what a global elite would want, launching a massive war, destabilizing global markets, and driving up energy prices, then you cannot whitewash Putin. You cannot claim he is some anti-globalist hero when his actions are perfectly fueling the very chaos the elites supposedly want. And who is censoring you? A host of pro-Russian speakers operate from the US. So Trewhella built a psychological breach of distrust, preconditioning the audience: if you stand with Ukraine, you are with the bad guys. And now he is ready to explain it all to you. So he states, quote, "Our country, the EU and NATO engineered a coup d'etat back in February of 2014, wherein the duly elected Prime Minister was thrown out of office through violence by mobs of people, wherein hundreds of people were killed," unquote. I almost had to double check if I was listening to an American preacher or Russian Federal State Radio, because he says the same thing as Russian State TV, but worse because he can't even get his basic facts straight. First, a quick history lesson for the speaker. Viktor Yanukovych was not the Prime Minister in 2014. He was the president when the Ukrainian people kicked him out and he fled to Russia, where he belongs. Ukraine has both roles. Yanukovych had been prime minister years earlier under the president Leonid Kuchma, and when he tried to steal the presidency through rampant fraud in 2004, the people filled the streets. I know because I was out there with them in 2004 before I moved to Spain in 2011. Pastors stood on the stage and the nation united against the election fraud when Putin shamefully congratulated Yanukovych before the official election results were announced. We had every right to protest because Article 5 of the Ukrainian constitution states explicitly that the people are the bearers of sovereignty and the only source of power. Ukraine is not Russia, where one dictator gets to run the show for over 25 years. The Supreme Court of Ukraine annulled that fraudulent 2004 vote, and the pro-Western candidate Viktor Yushchenko, who survived a literal Russian dioxin poisoning that left his face completely disfigured, won the rerun. Years later, after massive political gridlock, Yanukovych finally won the presidency in 2010, and his administration, this is the key, listen to it carefully, his administration spent 3 years actively pursuing and finalizing an association agreement with the European Union. It became official state policy, and he repeatedly promised the public he would sign it. But at very last minute in 2013, after intense economic blackmail and a multi-billion-dollar bailout package from Putin, he completely backed out. And the people saw themselves deceived. They took the streets again. When Yanukovych sent his police to brutally beat the protesters, the people fought back. The preacher called this a coup d'etat and mobs, echoing the exact vocabulary of the Kremlin. That's what he calls an alternative view, the Moscow view, he should say. Were there young, athletic, trained men on the front lines of the barricades against armed riot police? Of course they were. So what? You don't hold a line against brutal state security forces with ladies handing out cookies. He said that this revolution was engineered by the West. I don't have access to classified intelligence, and I don't speculate, but even if the West offered support, so what? Historians call this Ukraine's delayed war of independence. Ukrainians got their sovereignty on credit in 1991 when the USSR collapsed, but the real payment for freedom came later. The independence war came later. What's wrong in making alliances in a war? If the US and EU helped Ukraine to stand against Russia, what's wrong with that? Spain and France heavily financed and armed the Americans during their Revolutionary War. Does that make the American struggle for independence invalid? Does that make George Washington a puppet of the Spanish or French crown? Why is it that Yanukovych is allowed to be funded, protected, and propped up by the Kremlin, but the Ukrainian people aren't allowed to have allies in their own fight for freedom? Is that really what this pro-freedom American preacher is arguing? That Russian aid to their puppets is legitimate, but not if it comes from the West. Moving on, Trewhella states, quote, "We destabilized Ukraine, engineered a coup d'etat of a duly elected prime minister." By the way, do better your homework. He was not a prime minister at that time. And continuing his quote, "and have been pushing towards making Ukraine part of NATO," unquote. Again, the 2014 revolution known as Euromaidan, notice this, not NATO Maidan, Euromaidan, was directly caused by Yanukovych's refusal to sign the agreement with the EU. The protests erupted under Ukrainian and EU flags. Furthermore, what is fundamentally wrong with Ukraine becoming a NATO member if Ukrainians choose to join the alliance? What if tomorrow a referendum were held and the Ukrainian people voted for NATO? Is the will of a foreign dictator like Putin sovereign over the choices of the Ukrainian people? If you believe that Putin's will should prevail over the choice of millions of Ukrainians, then you don't deserve to live in a country that boasts about its freedoms. You'd be a better fit somewhere like China. But let's look at reality. It is not that easy to join NATO. Ukrainians may wholeheartedly desire NATO's protective umbrella to feel safe from Russia, which is why other Eastern European nations joined in the first place, seeking safety from their delightful neighbor, the Russian Federation. But a nation's desire isn't enough if the club doesn't want you. At the end of the day, Putin ironically strengthened NATO. First, look at the geography. Finland and Sweden, nations that clung to decades of strict neutrality, rushed to join NATO as a direct consequence of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. Instead of pushing NATO's borders back, Putin's aggression effectively doubled Russia's direct land border with the alliance. Secondly, Putin claimed one of the main goals of his so-called special military operation was the demilitarization of Ukraine. Today, Ukraine is militarized like never before in its history, possessing a defense industry that is more agile and advanced in drone, maritime and electronic warfare technology than many long-standing NATO members. The tables have turned so completely that it is no longer just a question of what NATO can give Ukraine, but how NATO needs Ukraine's real-world combat expertise and innovation. People love to portray Putin as this geostrategic genius, a master playing 8-dimensional chess. One Russian anti-Putin activist said, "With the sheer volume of resources Russia possesses, you could put anyone in the presidential seat of a country like that and they would look smart. You could put a cat in the Kremlin and with that much wealth at its disposal, it would look like a brilliant geostrategist, probably even better than Putin, because at least a cat wouldn't start a catastrophic war against its neighbor. And now this supposed genius is losing against a smaller adversary." A prime example of Putin's decline was his recent bizarre triple hurrah show for the Time of Heroes graduates. It was supposed to be this grand display of absolute certainty in victory. Instead, it became an internet laughingstock. This supposed mighty emperor ended his speech by shouting a triple hurrah that sounded so weak, slurred and muffled that he could barely get the words out. Trewhella obviously couldn't see into the future 4 years ago, but he deeply needs a lesson in history. The collapse of the Russian Empire began all the way back in 1917 when Poland and Finland broke away to secure their independence. The empire was then repackaged as the Soviet Union, which went on to collapse in 1991, where 15 separate republics got their independence, including Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Moldova, and ironically the Russian Federation itself. What we are witnessing right now is simply the final convulsive stage of that century-long imperial collapse. The Russian Empire seems to be over. It is now just a matter of time before history adds the final formal signature to its death certificate. Well, that was a lyrical digression. Back to the content. Trewhella says, Putin and the Russians have been warning against these moves repeatedly for over years, unquote. The reality is that Putin was actively scheming to absorb Ukrainian territory long before Donald Trump or Joe Biden overstepped into the Oval Office. Look at the history. Back in the fall of 2003, Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma was on an official state visit to Latin America. While he was away, Russia suddenly and unannounced began aggressively building a massive earthen dam through the Kerch Strait, driving straight toward Ukraine's Tuzla Island. Check out the Tuzla crisis, Tuzla, T-U-Z-L-A, Tuzla Island crisis. It was a blatant hybrid attempt to rewrite the maritime borders and seize control of the shipping channel by force. Putin was already testing Ukraine. President Kuchma had to urgently cut his international trip short, rush back to Ukraine and deploy armed border guards, giving the order to open fire if the Russians crossed the line. Earlier that very same year, in January 2003, Vladimir Putin himself sat down with Kuchma and signed the treaty on the Russian-Ukrainian state border. That bilateral international treaty explicitly recognized and finalized the borders between the two nations. It was passed by the Russian Duma and ratified by Putin's own signature in 2004. The document is still published on official Russian government's portals to this day. What is happening now, in 2026, is Russia violating that 2003 treaty, and Putin was testing Ukraine long before this invasion. Trewhella's rosy fairy tale narrative paints Russia as a harmless princess who never acts aggressively and never makes the first move. History shows Russia has been aggressively plotting this expansion for decades. Right before the 2022 invasion, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, a notoriously influential and long-serving deputy in the Russian parliament, openly declared that the world couldn't sustain three superpowers and that Russia would emerge as sole superpower. Trewhella's story continues with two Ukrainian provinces declaring their independence. Following the Revolution of Dignity, Euromaidan, Ukraine was vulnerable. For years, Yanukovych, acting as a Russian asset, had been systematically gutting and weakening the Ukrainian military from within. Taking full advantage of this weakness, Putin treacherously sent his troops into Crimea, but they didn't have the courage to show their faces or wear rank insignia. They came disguised without chevrons, the infamous little green man, a beautiful display of military honor and knightly tradition, right? The Americans wore their unit patches and flags in Iraq or Afghanistan, don't they? They don't have any issues at all to display their flags. Those little green men seized government headquarters by force and held a sham referendum at gunpoint in March 2014. Next, in April, they deployed almost the exact same playbook in the Donbas. Russian commandos, hiding behind unmarked uniforms, crossed the border under the command of Russian former FSB operative Igor Girkin, also known as Strelkov, who ironically is sitting in a Russian prison today because he later outlived his usefulness to the Kremlin, and he is accused by the International Court of being implied in having shot down Malaysia Airlines flight MH17. They seized administrative buildings, locked local dissenters in dark basements, and installed a puppet government made up of marginalized figures and actual Russian citizens. Trewhella conveniently leaves out the fact that there were massive pro-Ukrainian rallies with a sea of blue and yellow flags in Donetsk at that exact time. There was a massive pro-Ukrainian rally, but the handful of operatives sent by Moscow didn't bring flags only, they brought Kalashnikovs. To anyone claiming Russia wasn't operating directly in the Donbas since 2014, explain the 2016 prisoner exchange. Ukraine traded 2 captured regular Russian military intelligence officers for the abducted Ukrainian military pilot Nadia Savchenko. As for the legal validity of those referendums, it has the exact same legal weight as if my wife and I voted right now in our living room on whether the state of Wisconsin should join the EU. Moving on, quote, the Ukrainian government has allowed these militia-type groups of various tribes to bomb Donbas and Luhansk, the 2 provinces that broke away after the coup d'etat took place in 2014, unquote. Now saying 2 provinces, Donbas and Luhansk, sounds like 2 states, Midwest and Kentucky. He probably wanted to say Donetsk and Luhansk, Oblast, or just Donbas, encompassing both oblasts, both regions, but it was Donetsk and Luhansk. I don't think an NGO should scandalize anyone, if that's what he means. When Russia crossed the border in 2014, the regular Ukrainian military had been intentionally gutted, as said by the Yanukovych administration. To defend their homeland, ordinary Ukrainian citizens united. Teachers, programmers, and laborers formed volunteer battalions, heavily funded and supplied by a massive non-militarized civilian volunteer movement. Civil society fed, clothed, and equipped the men holding the line against Russian proxies. And yes, major Ukrainian business leaders backed them financially too. Why? They understood the stakes. They didn't want the lawless Russian mafia state swallowing their businesses. In a European system, you have established rules, corporate legal frameworks, and property rights. For Ukrainian commerce, supporting the volunteer battalions wasn't patriotism only, it was a logical defense of free enterprise and the rule of law against imperial gangsterism. Does the United States not have private military contractors? Did they deploy armed contractors to Iraq and Afghanistan under US government contracts? Europe itself has a long history of that, from medieval mercenary companies to the famous Swiss mercenaries who fought for hire across the continent for centuries. Now the timelines matters. The Russian commanders invaded, seized cities, and began firing on Ukrainian troops. They admitted. The already mentioned Russian operative Igor Girkin said he was the one who pulled the trigger of the war. So once they took cities in Donbas, they shot the Ukrainian troops from, attention, residential zones or including residential zones. The Ukrainian troops returned fire to where it came from. That is when the civilian population in the Donbas began to suffer. They began to suffer the exact moment the Russians entered. This banditry tactic of hiding behind civilians allows one to move borders as far as Portugal, hoping that the adversary will never fire in response. Now here is the thing. The ultimate proof that Russia launched this war in 2014 is simple. Where Russia came, the war began. Where Russia did not enter, people lived in complete tranquility, no matter who spoke which language. Before 2022, both Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers lived peacefully side by side in Kharkiv, in Zaporizhia, in Mariupol, in Odessa. There were no bombs, no artillery, and no shellings in those cities for 8 years. Why? Because the Russian military wasn't there. The catastrophe of the Donbas lies entirely at the feet of the Kremlin. Let's move on to NATO representing a threat to Russia. He basically says Russia views NATO as representing a threat to their nation, as if Russia never represented a threat to its neighbors. But let's develop a little bit on Russia and its nation issue. There is an important distinction here, a fundamental geographical and historical reality, which might be interesting to an unbiased listener. The entity called the Russian Federation is not a single, unified nation-state. It is an empire, it is a home to scores of completely distinct ethnicities and nations that have absolutely nothing in common with ethnic Russians. We are talking about millions of people who are ethnically, linguistically, culturally, and religiously entirely separate from Moscow, from the Chechens and the Dagestanis, the Tatars and Bashkirs in the Volga region, Buryats near Mongolia, or the Yakuts and Tuvan people in the depth of Siberia. These are separate peoples with their own ancient languages, non-Slavic roots, just in case to comment on the Russian nation, ethnically speaking. Trewhella's reference to the Cuban missile crisis is the first thing which sounds like common sense in his speech. The problem is that Russia did more than react defensively. As someone who is fluent in Russian and actually listens to what they say, I can tell you what drives their national psychology. Their entire domestic rhetoric is fueled by a cocktail of deep historical resentment over losing the Cold War, mixed with aggressive revanchism, the obsessive desire to seek revenge and reclaim lost imperial weight. Check my video, Russian Imperial Soul. Moscow has been actively plotting to retake Ukraine for decades, driven by a desperate need to reclaim its lost imperial status. Geopolitically, without Ukraine, Russia is merely a regional power, but with Ukraine it becomes a global power. Ukraine is the indispensable gateway to Europe, and the Black Sea provides vital access to the Mediterranean and global trade routes. Moscow cannot project true imperial power without dominating Kiev. Russia's ambitions go far beyond a more defensive reaction. In fact, Putin, when asked by a boy where the Russian border is, once said that Russia's borders never end. What? Also, if Putin was concerned about missile flight time, then he achieved the opposite result, because the Baltic Sea has effectively turned into NATO's inland lake now that Sweden and Finland have officially joined the alliance, and NATO is closer to Russia now than before the war Putin started. Now the Ukrainian government moving toward obtaining and producing nuclear weapons. Trewhella gets it all out of context. On February 19, 2022, not 2 weeks before the full-scale invasion, at the München Security Conference, Zelensky brought up the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, the international treaty where Ukraine voluntarily surrendered the third largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. Ukraine was a nuclear power. In exchange for giving up those weapons, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom signed a document promising to guarantee Ukraine's security and respect its borders. Zelensky's point was that Russia had already violated the treaty in 2014, and the West had spent 8 years doing nothing. He warned that if the Western guarantors refused to even sit down for emergency consultations to protect Ukraine, then Ukraine would look at the entire 1994 diplomatic package as a dead letter. So sure, Trewhella, if you think that the treaty is dead, let's give Ukraine its nuclear weapons back. Let's not forget the Budapest Memorandum wasn't just signed by Boris Yeltsin, it was signed by your own president, Bill Clinton. Now biological weapons labs. Dozens of sovereign nations around the globe have biolabs. What country will we pick next to invade? Again, Matthew didn't know that by 2026 Russia would significantly de-emphasize the biolabs narrative. They have quietly moved on to back ever-shifting narratives like defending the motherland and stuff like that, whatever fits the moment. As for Moscow's supposedly ironclad documentation, we are talking about a regime whose forgery department is so lazy and they don't even bother to properly hide the traces of their own fabrications. They have been caught multiple times using video game footage or images and presenting them as real military evidence. But Trewhella looks at his audience and says that the US government has been lying the whole time while Russia has been telling the truth. He wants you to believe Russia tells the truth, the same Russia that spent months in 2014 swearing that the unmarked little green men invading Crimea weren't Russian soldiers, only for Putin to casually admit on television a year later that they were his troops. The same Russia that spent the winter of 2022 mocking Western intelligence, swearing up and down they were just doing exercises and had zero intention of invading Ukraine, right up until the night they launched the missiles. If you want to understand the true nature of Russian state deception, you should read what the 17th century Puritan Thomas Brooks wrote in his famous books, Precious Remedies Against Satan's Devices. In it, he described the sheer malice of the Russians of his day, writing that they were so malicious that a man would secretly hide his own goods in the house of someone he hated just to turn around and falsely accuse him of stealing them. The next section of Trewhella's arguments is money. He says three things. First, the West is seizing Russian money. Well, first of all, Putin's genius started the war against the West, leaving Russian money in the West. By the way, it's where Russian elites love to have their properties, businesses and citizenships while speaking ill against NATO. For some reason, they prefer NATO countries to settle their families in the state. NATO's security umbrella looks safe. It's not Chavez or Maduro who might easily confiscate your property. But secondly, the logic is that if Russia wants to fight, let her pay for it. And do you think other European countries aren't concerned about Russian expansion? I'm not referring to Germany, France, Italy and Spain, but rather Poland and Baltic states, especially the Baltics. Poland is strong and Russia doesn't attack somebody knowing they are strong enough to slap back. But Baltic countries are smaller. Even if major powers like Germany took a softer, more conciliatory approach toward Moscow, those Eastern European nations, as EU and NATO members, would maintain a fierce, uncompromising vigilance against the Russian threat. Trewhella appears to believe that Putin is fighting for all of you guys. He is concerned about your well-being and freedom. Quote, Putin is building a sustainable alternative economy from the one world hell the global tyrants have built and are trying to enslave everyone to through their digital technology, unquote. Right now, Russia's closest ally, China, is the ultimate example of a totalitarian digital gulag, and Putin is aggressively copying their framework. Trewhella obviously didn't know this when he preached his sermon, but the Russian government now mandates a state-controlled super app called Max that must be pre-installed on every smartphone and tablet sold in the country. This app is tied directly into their government services database, which the Kremlin uses to monitor location data, read private messages, and issue electronic military conscription notices. If you try to opt out of their digital tracking, the state can instantly freeze your driver's license, block your bank account, and ban you from leaving the country. It is a system of absolute surveillance and coercion. Everyday citizens in Russia are forced to carry two separate cell phones, one phone dedicated entirely to running the mandatory state-approved apps so they don't lose access to basic society, and a complete separate phone for their actual private life. Putin isn't fighting digital enslavement, he is the one building the prison cells. The ultimate advantage of living in the West is that our society is built differently. You may wholeheartedly strive against technological surveillance, you may criticize a cashless society, but please don't say Russia is leading the fight, because it is among those pushing surveillance most aggressively. In the West, we still possess a robust, horizontal civil society, deeply distinct from the collectivist mindset dominating in parts of East Asia and Russia. We have a culture rooted in individual conscience, and we still have a separation of powers. This difference runs deeper than politics. It is woven into our heritage and our very perception of human value. I was recently watching a video by Ukrainian influencer Andriy Popik, one of those who debate Russians online through chat roulette. He encountered a young Chinese woman studying in Moscow who began regurgitating the standard line that the United States is uniquely aggressive. Andriy stopped her saying, well, Americans don't crush their own protesters with tanks. Your regime did exactly that to students in Tiananmen Square. The girl's point was basically like, but in other words, well, if they deserved it. That response is telling. We are dealing with different civilizations. Our governments are monitored, criticized, and held in check by the people, the press, and the courts, and yes, the press. Here in Spain, right now, the ruling Socialist Party, PSOE, is being actively investigated. Just this week, the Guardia Civil, or La OCU, searched the party's national headquarters in Madrid as part of a corruption probe, where multiple party officials are being scrutinized. All of this is happening openly in real time, with the press covering every detail, ones in favor, others against. It's possible in the West. Imagine if the Guardia Civil spent hours searching Putin's office or United Russia headquarters. It's unthinkable in Russia. That is the fundamental difference. Russia and China operate on an entirely different wave, a top-down, authoritarian, collectivist mindset where the individual exists only to serve the state. So if an Orwellian digital world is already introduced to us all, there is still difference in how it plays out right now and how different societies face it. In the West, because of our institutions and resistance, we might experience that surveillance, let's say 30% capacity. In Russia and China, it may hit 70%. In the West, technology is a tool we still fight to regulate. We can speak out loud, but try to speak loud in Russia. So Trewhella is mixing the state's control of money with Putin, called the bad guy by the media. But do you really think Vladimir Putin is the solution to state control over your money? And then he goes after Zelensky, calling him an evil, disturbing, filthy man. Trewhella tells people to research it, but then repeatedly feeds them his own conclusions and shares his cherry-picked links. The media is bad, his narrative is good, the US is lying, Russia is telling the truth. On social issues, Ukraine's constitution, Article 51, clearly defines marriage as a union between a man and a woman. Before lecturing Ukraine, maybe clean up your own house first. Ukraine remains a deeply traditional, family-oriented society. Zelensky has never proactively pushed progressive social policies, not that I know. He simply maintained the existing laws. Zelensky is not a biblical Christian, and if you are a theonomist, your frustration makes sense, but it seems very selective. Why so little concern about far more authoritarian and secular leaders, including Putin? Why not first address the liberal cultural exports coming from your own country for decades, Hollywood, the sexual revolution spread by your pop culture, and so on? Fix your own house before lecturing a foreign society that is in many ways more traditional than modern America. The strongest Western pressure on Ukraine regarding progressive social policies actually came during the previous administration of Petro Poroshenko. Despite that pressure, Ukrainians have remained quite reluctant to adopt liberal Western social agenda. Trewhella is largely exaggerating or inventing a cultural and social threat coming from Ukraine in order to rally his audience in favor of Russia. Does Zelensky really call Justin Trudeau his hero and mentor, as Trewhella claims? Or were his exact words that Trudeau was one of those who inspired him to go into politics? That's not the same thing. You have to understand diplomatic language. In Spanish, we have a proverb, buscar la quinta pata al gato, looking for the fifth legs on a cat. Trewhella is searching for any excuse to demonize Ukraine by twisting normal diplomatic politeness into some grand cultural conspiracy. I said at the beginning that I listened to Trewhella years ago, occasionally, but I no longer do. If anyone asks me today, I would honestly caution them. The strength of his support for the Russian position is deeply concerning. Concluding on Zelensky, he is married, his kids are known, Putin has no public family structure, he is divorced. So who is more traditional? Zelensky, married for over 22 years to Olena Zelensky, who he knew from high school, or Putin, divorced in 2013. Then he speaks of the World Economic Forum. I don't especially like it, and here in Europe, politicians and media have a serious discussion against it. But do you honestly think Russia's dominance is the answer? Or are you living in a fantasy world where every nation just isolates itself and lives in a perfect independent bubble and no power fills the vacuum when it appears? It would be great if every nation just acted entirely on its own. I agree, that sounds amazing, but in what historical epoch did you ever find that world? Did you find it during Alexander the Great's conquest? During Roman dominance, perhaps? Or when the first global empires, the Spanish Empire, and many argue the most important one, navigated the seas from the end of the earth, from one end of the earth to the other? Trewhella seems to believe that if Western or US influence is broken, the world will just become a peaceful garden. If the West falls, others will fill the vacuum, and Lord have mercy if it's China. Economically speaking, I prefer old European traditions, quality, and the culture of excellence. I appreciate my German car. I don't want Chinese junk. I don't want to eat artificial, state-mandated food. I like Spanish ham, Spanish cheese, and I certainly don't want to have to earn digital social credit points just to be allowed to fill up my gas tank. By the way, the USA is a part of European civilization. We share the same civilizational frame. The English, Germans, Italians, Irish, Scots, Dutch, Scandinavians, Slavs. Spanish history books sometimes downplay the Spanish role because the British Empire was excellent at winning the propaganda war against its rival Spanish Empire for global dominance. But spiritually and politically, why would any Christian minister ever strive to weaken Western influence in the world? Where are Christians more protected than in the West? In Muslim countries, perhaps? In North Korea? In China? Let's move to the conclusion. Trewhella asks if anyone believes that Western governments truly care about the Ukrainian people. Well, it's obvious they are acting out of self-interest. Who was born yesterday to think otherwise? Of course, geopolitics is driven by interest. He is stating obvious things as if they were discoveries. The West wants to check the power of Russia, which has become China's battering ram against European civilization, and Ukrainians want their freedom from Russia. The interests aligned. The core truth this preacher completely ignores is that Ukrainians simply do not want to be part of Russia. If the people's voice means anything to him, we represent different societal mindsets. Ukraine is a strongly horizontal society, whereas Russia operates on a rigid vertical hierarchy and has historically leaned toward monarchical absolutism. Russia is a Eurasian cross-continental empire, reaching its influence even to Africa. Ukraine is rooted in Western heritage, heavily forged by Christian history. Ukrainians have their own identity, their own language, their own traditions, and strive against being absorbed by Russia. For decades, the only thing Ukrainians ever wanted to say to Moscow was this simple one: just leave us alone. Not sure if it didn't grow now to a wish to see Russia dissolved. Check out my video about the viable fall of Russia. Vladimir Putin messed up catastrophically. By launching this brutal war, he has driven a lot of people mad. Now, after 5 years, or even since 2014, it might be more than just leave us alone from the Ukrainian side. Now a weakened Russia might find that a resilient Ukraine alongside Poland and the Baltic states is ready to lead the future of Europe. Who knows? But before all of that mess, the message was just leave us alone. Ukrainians want their freedom. Thanks for watching and see you next time.